A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim.
Shalom.
Many Jews feel that it is unreasonable to continue using terms and phrases in our prayers which are at odds with reality. On the other hand, many claim that we may not change a single letter in our prayer books. What is the Rabbi's approach to this matter?
First of all, in this connection, we should mention the Mishnah at the end of Masechet Berachot, which speaks of a tefillat shel, a prayer which is dishonest or relates to something which has already happened. In other words, to pray that such and such be the case in the future when the event has already happened, such as the example in the Mishnah that a person hears cries of anguish and distress from a certain part of the city in which direction his house is also to be found, and he prays that it not be in his house. This is of course something that has already happened, and the Mishnah says this is a tefillat shel, this is an empty prayer without any meaning or significance, and therefore it is not to be said. In other words, we see from this that prayer is to be relevant and has to be honest and has to fit the facts and the realities and common sense. In addition, there is the question of being seen to be kefuyei tova. In other words, that our prayers should not imply that we are ungrateful to Hashem for that which He has already done for us and for the Jewish people, as if we do not recognize that which has happened, that which has changed for the better in both our national and also in our personal lives. This also is a very serious error, to continue to pray in such a way which does not suggest that we thank Hashem and recognize that which Hashem has done for us. We also find in the Siddur of Rav Saadia Gaon on page 10, in the introduction, he writes that the tefillot, the prayers such as the Shmoneh Esrei and the different brachot, the blessings that we say, are not to be found written explicitly in the Tanakh, and therefore we rely on the traditions that we have received from the prophets and from the sages, from Anshe Knesset HaGedolah and the other Chachamim who followed them. And he goes on to say, Samechu al ma shekibbelu ha'anashim b'mesorah min nevi'ei Hashem. We rely, the Chachamim also relied first and foremost on that which they received from the last of the prophets, who were also active and had influence over the early generations of Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly. وَهَيُّ لَهَمْ شْنَي سَدَرِيم. And here Rav Saadia Gaon says that there were all along two orders of prayer. Ehav l'zman ha'melucha, one order of prayer, that is to say, one set of prayers and phrases and terms to be used l'zman ha'melucha, literally for the time of the kingship, or you could translate perhaps more correctly for the time of Jewish independence and sovereignty, when the Jewish people live in their land as a sovereign nation. وَهَذَا زْمَنَ galuth, and another order of prayer, or another set of terms and phrases to be used when the Jewish people find themselves in exile. Exile here could refer both to exile literally in different parts of the world. It could also refer to living in a kind of exile, that is to say, even here in Eretz Yisrael, under foreign rule and occupation, such as under Roman rule, etc., particularly after the destruction of the temple of the Mikdash. Clearly, realities changed, and the tefillah also had to change with it. And this is the point that Rav Saadia Gaon is making here. And in the same book, on page 6, Rav Saadia Gaon states as follows, discussing the different berachot in the Shmoneh Esrei, the different blessings we find in the Shmoneh Esrei. He says, Lo hayu zekokim b'yemei avotenu lomar mekabes nidhei amo Yisrael. It was not necessary when all the Jews were in Eretz Yisrael to pray for the ingathering of the exiles, because they were already here. It was not necessary to pray for the rebuilding of Yerushalayim, because it was already built. So what did they say in place of these prayers? Instead, they prayed for the continued existence of the Jewish state, the sovereign Jewish existence of the Jewish people in their land, and that they should be victorious over their enemies in war, etc., according to the needs of every generation. On the basis of these very clear and unambiguous statements of Rav Saadia Gaon, we understand that we must address the question of what we say in our tefilloth today, at the present time, when the reality of the Jewish people has changed so dramatically and is so very different from that which existed even 100 years ago, and certainly 300 years ago, and certainly 1100 years ago, since the time of Rav Saadia Gaon. Today, at least a half, and probably a majority of the Jewish people live in Eretz Yisrael, and if this is somewhat debated still, it will certainly be no longer a cause for debate in only a matter of a few years, with the very high rate of assimilation overseas, etc. The reality of a Jewish sovereign entity in Eretz Yisrael, in our homeland, for nearly 70 years now, and the fact that the state of Israel is no longer a chimera, no longer something which, as it was in its early days, that it is hard to believe will continue to exist, but is something that is firmly rooted in the reality of, in the political, economic and military realities of the world as we know it. In this kind of situation, despite all the problems that we face and the challenges and the many things that are lacking still in the Jewish people's state here in the land of Israel, nevertheless, the situation is such that we must take note of these changes and make necessary changes to our tefillah if we are not to appear ungrateful before Hashem, and if we are not to speak words which are simply not true in our prayers to Hashem. And therefore, in the barakah that we say immediately before Kriyat Shema in the morning, where we say, in most Sidurim one finds, V'havi'enu l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz, gather us from the four corners of the earth to our land. Instead of saying this, at least those of us, certainly those of us who are here in Eretz Yisrael today, should, in my view, say, V'haveh l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz, and bring our brothers, our brethren from overseas who are still there, bring them here to Eretz Yisrael to join us. To suggest in our prayer that we who are here in Eretz Yisrael are not here as if we consider ourselves to be in the Galuth, this is something which is entirely wrong and unacceptable. Another example would be from the Shmoneh Esrei, the Bracha Tikah b'shofar gadol leheruthenu. I suggest, seeing that historically and objectively speaking, the change in the reality of the Jewish people's existence from being a nation ruled by others to a nation that rules itself, and that, I believe, is the definition of heruth, of freedom, of independence and sovereignty. That change took place again nearly 70 years ago, and therefore, instead of saying Tikah b'shofar gadol leheruthenu, I believe we should simply say Tikah b'shofar gadol v'sa nes lekabes galuyotenu, and raise a banner to ingather our exiles, or even perhaps add another word or two to imply that there are only some of our nation is still left overseas, but certainly not to imply that we are in the same situation as we were many generations ago. There are, of course, even more outrageous examples of prayers and statements which clearly cannot be made certainly not by Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, and I think also really not by Jews living today in Chutz La'aretz. For example, in this Siddur which I have in my hand here, which is a Siddur put out by Koren in Tafshin Membet, 1982, on page 52, this is a Nusach Ashkenaz Siddur. The Tahanunim that are said on Mondays and Thursdays, at the bottom of the page, it says, Husa Adonai Alenu, have mercy on us, Hashem, Be'eretz Shivyenu, here in the land of our captivity. For a person in Eretz Yisrael to say these words, that we are Be'eretz Shivyenu, I think is an outrageous statement. Not only is it untrue, not only is it a lie, it is grossly improper to as it were, throw the gift of being here in Eretz Yisrael back in the face of Hashem and deny that such a thing is in fact the reality. This is truly an outrageous statement, which, by the way, has been removed in many Sidurim, but in many it also still remains. Such a statement, of course, has to be deleted altogether. In fact, many of the statements in the Tahanunim, at least of the Nusach of the Ashkenazim that are said on Mondays and Thursdays, and similarly many of the Salihoth and many of the Kinoth that the Ashkenazim and the Sfaradim and the Temanim say on different days of the year, Salihoth connected to the period of the Salihoth before Rosh Hashanah, or Salihoth said on certain fast days, and Kinoth said on Tisha B'Av, etc. There are many, many statements in all the different traditions of the different Eidoth which are simply impossible for a reasonable and honest, intelligent person to continue saying at the present time. And therefore, many of these things, which were of course entirely accurate and true and precise when they were written, they described an objective historical reality, and the Jews had no option really but to cry out to Hashem that He redeem them and save them from their impossible state of affairs, the impossible type of existence that they were leading in the exile. At that time it was proper to say these things, but at this time it is not proper to say these things. Just as we find in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yod Het, in the Talmud Bavli, that even the 3 minor fast days are alternately considered to be obligatory or optional, or in a perfect or near perfect reality, they even become, instead of fast days, they become days, obligatory days of rejoicing and thanksgiving to Hashem. The reality, therefore, we see must influence the halacha and the actual practice of Judaism in the real world. This is how Chazal intended things to be, and this is, of course, what we should be doing today. The only question, of course, is who will take the plunge, who will make the decision. Most people, of course, are waiting for someone else to make the decision, and this applies also to most rabbis. Most rabbis do not wish to assume the responsibility and do not wish to be the ones to rock the boat and to stand out and to say something which is perhaps going to bring criticism upon their heads, and therefore this issue is very rarely addressed either by rabbis or laymen. Everyone simply continues doing as before out of a kind of either fear or lack of interest and perhaps an attitude which suggests that anyhow we don't really mean what we say, so what's the difference? But this, of course, is incorrect and in fact very detrimental to the true spirit of Torah Judaism, which has to be based on truth and clarity and being connected to the events and the current situation of the Jewish people.
Can the rabbi expand upon the reason he thinks that rabbis and laymen are reluctant to make the necessary changes?
I think there are clearly 2 reasons for this reluctance. Firstly, the conception or misconception from which many people suffer, namely that if my father or grandfather acted in a certain way, prayed in a certain way, then I must also therefore continue to do exactly as he did. In other words, the idea that Torah Judaism is always about, foremost and above all other considerations, Torah Judaism is always about doing exactly as was done a generation or two or three before. And this, as we explained, is clearly not true. We have many examples of this, as we already detailed from Rav Saadia Gaon, and Rashi, for example, says exactly the same thing in the Talmud when he discusses the bracha that was said by the Kohanim, and that which we today say in the Shmoneh Esrei regarding the temple service. When there was a temple, Rashi says, they didn't pray for the return of the service because there was such a service. He says in Masechet Berachot that they prayed for the service to be acceptable before Hashem. So this misconception needs to be undone. It has to be explained to people that this is not the overriding concern of Judaism. When the reality changes for the better because Hashem has decided to move the Jewish people into a new historical reality, we, the Jewish people, must have the understanding and the courage, if you want to call it that, to do the right thing and to make the correct changes to fit that new reality. Another consideration, I think, or another reason for this reluctance, is an overreaction which has been going on now for well over 2 centuries to Reform Judaism. In the eyes of many Orthodox Jews, anything at all, any kind of change at all recommended or suggested with regards to any aspect of Judaism, particularly with regards to prayers, is immediately connected in their minds to Reform Judaism. It is true that the early Reform Jews pointed out, and they happened to be correct in some of the points that they made, that certain things were anachronistic in the prayer book and needed perhaps to be changed. But this does not mean that that which is true becomes untrue simply because the point was first made perhaps by someone who later was known as a reformer of Judaism and whose real intention was to make it much easier for Jews in Germany, shall we say, in the late 18th century to become part of mainstream mainstream German society. And really their intention was not to improve or recalibrate Judaism, but to create a new kind of reality for German Jews in which they could become more German and less Jewish. That criticism of Reform Judaism, of course, is entirely true, as history bears out. But the overreaction to that movement and those ideas at that time, which today results in a knee-jerk reaction to any suggestion of reassessing certain areas of Jewish practice, that is a mistake, and it is well beyond now the time. It is high time that we get over that historical knee-jerk reaction.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.